Folks, it's the bewitching hour. Welcome to the Energy Academy class. Without further ado, please welcome our professor, distinguished expert on all things energy, Mr. Mark Pruitt. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just get my screen up here. And not that screen. Let's try one that actually has a presentation on it. So many screens. Okay, here we go. How's that?
Looks good.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you joining us for our fifth class. Now we've got a lot of the background stuff behind us, and now we're going to spend this session and the next few sessions talking more specifics about what municipalities can do in the energy sector. So this is the applied portion, right? Enough with the theory and the history. You have that context. Now we're going to get into this discussion about, well, what is it we can do? What are the constraints? And constraints are important because we need to build plans at the local level that recognize the constraints, operate around them sometimes, and just, they set realistic expectations. So that's what today's going to be about, is the energy transition goals and constraints. Same agenda as before, a few housekeeping items, some resources that I think might be helpful to you, then on to the lecture, and then discussion at the end. So I will try to leave enough time at the end so we have discussion, but never fear, if you want to stay beyond the 1 o'clock hour, we'll keep answering questions as long as you have them. But we will let you go at 1 for those of you who have other things you need to get to. So housekeeping, Edith and Cheryl indicated to me before we started up that there's no announcements. So we're just going to buzz right down to requests for the specifics course items. As you may recall, there's a slug of time that's available after the classes where we can get together and work on one or more projects that would be replicable, practical, and useful by the municipalities based on what we learned in the class. So we've had some suggestions. We've had folks who said, boy, really addressing that franchise agreement issue would be great. Bringing in more renewable energy to the municipal operations would be great. How do we do that? So that's what this 10 hours is about, is let's build a plan that the various municipalities can take internally and build up something that will actually work, that observes the policies and constraints in Illinois, fully accesses all of the resources, and then gives you this plan of action to deploy something yet this year. So that's if you have a desire to get a new energy project up and going this year, bring that topic to us, and we'll see, in the collective wisdom of the group, how many municipalities would see value in that idea. And if it's one of our top ones, we can do it. We can scale it to as many municipalities as possible and move on. And then always, if there's recommendations for things that we can cover in the class, we have 2 left, so we have time. Or if you just have, you're looking for a specific resource and you haven't been able to find a piece of data that's really important to you, let me know, and we'll stick it into presentations, or we'll just give it to you direct. So on to resources. As you know, I'm a big fan of original sources, right? So it's good to read things in the newspaper and see press releases and that, but it's, in my mind, even better to go back to the original documents that establish these policies, procedures, and practices in the energy sector. So that's what we have here today. I know that there's been a lot of interest in renewables by municipalities over the past number of years. And it occurred to me that maybe you need to be able to get access directly to the renewable program in Illinois, which is called Illinois Shines. That's part of the Illinois Adjustable Block Program. Illinois Shines, you see here is a hyperlink to it. That'll take you to the Illinois Power Agency. And this is the IG of all things renewable for behind the meter solar as well as community solar in Illinois. So to the extent you want that type of information, you can definitely get it there. Now, it's one of those circumstances where maybe it's too much information, but really they've done a pretty good job of breaking it down, makes it pretty accessible. So if you're interested in solar, community solar, behind the meter type activities, that's where it's going to be. Based on some conversations in Springfield, I expect that there's going to be a storage standard that comes out fairly soon as well. That will probably also fall into Illinois Shines. Next resource here is on Illinois energy efficiency, and I think Edith can speak to this. The energy efficiency programs from the utilities are designed, developed, vetted, evaluated, and reported on in a group called the Stakeholder Advisory Group. And the Stakeholder Advisory Group is the utilities, the Illinois Commerce Commission, and other stakeholders, Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance and the like, that are deeply involved in energy efficiency programs that are offered by the utilities, both gas and electric. So the Illinois SAG website gives you the full history of energy efficiency programs going all the way back to when energy efficiency programs started. I believe that might be as early as 2009. So you can see the reports, where the utilities have spent the money, what they report as the results of those programs, and give you a sense of the scale. I thought this might be important because on a statewide basis, there's over $500 million a year flowing into energy efficiency programs through the utilities. And it's important to understand where your options are. So this is the place to go to get all that original information. And then lastly is another resource from our friends at the Illinois Commerce Commission, where they have their annual report on electricity, gas, and water utilities. And this resource is a very good primer, right? It doesn't require a ton of time. It's well written, very concise, but it gives you that snapshot in time of what's going on with utilities, what are the major cases, tariffs, rate changes, legal changes, performance evaluations of the various utilities in Illinois. So again, does this answer all your questions? Probably not, but it's a great place to start to get a better understanding of how the utilities are operating in Illinois. It might prompt some questions that then can serve as the basis for how you proceed with your planning. So that's the resources. The website of the week, I thought, kind of the solar theme, is the hosting capacity mapping tool for Commonwealth Edison. You see the link over on the left. This is a tool that Commonwealth Edison has put together that identifies their service area. You see that on the map, all the colored blocks. That's all areas served by ComEd. And within each of those blocks, they've identified how much more behind the meter renewable energy resources can be accommodated within the distribution system. So the idea here is to give people a sense of, is the ComEd distribution system ready or not ready to bring on more rooftop solar or community solar within the region? And the color coding gives you that quick read of, does our ComEd system have that capacity to allow the energy to flow both ways, right? From the regional grid to the customer, and then from the customer out to the regional grid in those times when the rooftop solar or the community solar is generating more than is being consumed at the point of generation. What I thought was interesting about this tool is that it allows you to zoom in. Now, I'm graphically oriented, so I'm always fascinated by pictures, but where this really starts to get some value, I think perhaps for the people attending this class or this course, is that if you are trying to derive or get an idea of how much solar can be accommodated within our community, this is where you could start to zero in. You could go down to the sub-regional level that we have here. And again, the color coding gives you a sense of what areas have a lot of available capacity, meaning they can accommodate more, and those that have less. You see the areas here around St. Charles, Batavia, and Naperville. Those are not color coded because those are areas served by municipal utilities. All the other areas, though, are ComEd service territories. If you get down to the neighborhood level, I just zeroed in here on Oak Park, Forest Park, Maywood. You do get down to a very high level of detail, almost not quite, but almost on a block by block basis. You see here on the south of the expressway, there's a little bit less hosting capacity than north of the expressway, right? And again, this is not to tell you where the solar is going to go. It tells you where it can go, given the equipment and the infrastructure that's available today. And then lastly, if you get down to a specific location, a specific address, you can click and you can start your application process, the interconnection process with ComEd, which is where you really need to start. If you're going to put on rooftop solar or community solar, you have to go through an interconnection study with ComEd, and this is one of the ways to start. So anyway, I hope this is helpful, and maybe it's something that you've seen before, but I think that this gives good context for those municipalities that are trying to come up with a plan to improve the deployment of renewable energy within their municipal boundaries. I think this is a great place to start. It gives you a quick sense of what's viable given today's infrastructure. So I hope that was helpful. On to the lecture. So, sorry, clicking stuff here. So I'm going to be talking to issues that are probably visited by folks who sit on sustainability commissions, who have a deep interest in sustainability. And nothing of what I'm going to say here today is a criticism. These are just observations, having been through a lot of these conversations myself over the years. So this is the starting point. When a lot of us in the energy industry or the policy side of the business start talking about the energy transition, right? We have a tendency to get very excited about it. There's equipment, there's policy, there's regulation, there's financing, there's jobs, there's all these things that go on. And I'm pretty convinced that most people who are not from the policy or the energy sector kind of get something like this picture in their head. You know, you say energy transition, and then you start kind of moving down the line, talking about all the things that can happen. And I think most civilians, they get a little overwhelmed, right? Because this isn't what they think about every day. It seems very confusing. It seems risky. And I think it tends to turn people off, right? Because I think on a good day, most people don't quite understand the utility bill that they're getting today. And I think that they know that intuitively, that they don't quite understand everything that's going on or that's in that bill. So proposing a change seems kind of risky, right? You're moving even further away from things that they know. So when we talk about the energy transition, and this is my recommendation, is that maybe simplifying the conversation is a first thing, first order activity that maybe you can consider. This is the policy triangle, or the transition triangle, that seems to make sense to folks that I speak to, both for education and for policy. And this was put together by the World Economic Forum. And it says, look, when we're talking about the transition, we're talking about the energy sector. And we're talking about changes in the energy sector that can impact sustainability, security, and economic development. You stick with those three things, that's your vision, that the energy sector can improve in each of these arenas, then I think you've got a basis for a conversation with voters, citizens, residents, other stakeholders. Okay. So what does all this mean? Well, when we're talking about sustainability, of course, we're talking about efficiency. We're talking about renewables, electrification, right? Electrify everything is a bumper sticker I've seen out there. Carbon capture. These are all the things that are intended to make the environment, the air, water, and earth cleaner, and to have less of an impact on them in the production, transmission, and use of energy. So this is that subcategory of what is environmental sustainability. And again, there's other definitions, and you can plug your own in. I'm just giving these to you as my shorthand version of how I try to structure these conversations. When we talk about security and access, what we're really talking about, or what I'm talking about, is reliability. We want the lights to stay on. We want resiliency, which means we can get the lights back on after they've gone out, right? After a storm or a flood. We want security. We want to know that our information as consumers, our names, our credit card numbers, our utility consumption numbers aren't available to just anybody, right? That there is a level of privacy here. And then optionality. We want to be able to choose to get our electricity from the grid, produce our own with our rooftop solar, use battery storage, connect my electric vehicle. We want security and access to be those things that allow for a lot of personal choice, right? So that's another aspect of the energy transition, is we want to improve those elements. And then lastly, and sometimes this one gets a little controversial, but there's this economic development element, of jobs, right? Is there bandwidth in converting over to different energy sources, different technologies that provide for new jobs or different jobs for folks who are already in the energy sector? We're thinking about infrastructure. We're thinking about equity a lot of times. Do we have underserved or negatively impacted populations that have not been able to benefit from the energy sector investments in the past? But we also need to balance all this against consumer costs. You might have seen in the cranes earlier this week that during what they're calling the ComEd 4 trial in federal court in Chicago, one of the ComEd staffers gave a number of the relative value of the Future Energy Jobs Act to Commonwealth Edison. Commonwealth Edison supported Future Energy Jobs Act. And one of the reasons they supported it was that it was worth $180 million to them. I'm sorry, $1.8 billion to them. It was a big number, right? And my first thought was, well, you got fined $200 million, but you got 1.8 billion out of it. Yeah, it's pretty good turn. The second thought I had was that more than $1 billion came out of consumers' pockets. So even though efficiency is good, it has an impact. It has a cost, right? None of this is free. So recognizing all of these elements together is how I suggest structuring your conversations and phasing in your conversations about sustainability, just so that you avoid kind of that confusing map that we started out with. So what's really helpful is that when you start talking about this and bringing in these different elements, now you can organize how you're going to do this, right? It's no magic bullet. There's no single way of doing this. An energy transition in Illinois is going to be different than an energy transition in California, different than Hawaii, different than China, different than India, different than Europe, right? Because you have different assets and different constraints in each of those markets. You may have seen, and I hope you have, the Climate Action Plan for the Chicago region from the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, which identifies a pathway to getting to an 80% reduction of carbon emissions, metric tons of CO2 emissions or equivalents per year. And you see the top line in this graph, the dotted line at the top, that's the current trajectory. But if we start thinking about this transition in those three sectors, if we start with efficiency, which is the building energy slice, if we improve efficiency over time, if we bring in more renewable energy, clean energy policy, green slice, and then you decarbonize our energy sources, right? More utility scale renewables. And then you start to address water and waste, and then you decarbonize transportation, and on down the line, you start to shave away at these emissions, and you start to build out a plan of action for reducing those emissions and addressing that sustainability portion of your energy transition triangle. Once you've worked through your approaches, then you can start thinking about your progression. What comes first? So many times, these progressive phases happen over decades, right? So this is a graphic that was provided about the dynamic modeling and control of carbon capture process for sustainable power, right? Long academic paper, right? But the premise here is that none of this happens overnight. I know that a lot of times people want to have an immediate plan of action that's going to yield immediate changes. But I think the more realistic way of looking at this is to say, okay, we're not just starting today. This transition actually started back in the 90s. We're in the 20s now. We're starting to see the development of the full implementation of technologies that came about in the 90s. So that's the renewable energy, and those are now more affordable and they're more deployable. Great. So now that we can get solar panels at an affordable rate, now how do we get them built into our distribution network? Remember, it's not just a one-way network anymore. It works both ways. That's where we're working on right now. How do we get deployments to expand and take advantage of these new energy resources? Eventually, we'll probably move on to different types of fuels that can be used in place of natural gas or petroleum products. And then finally, somewhere 2050, somewhere down the road, there might be final defossilization. But that's way down the road, right? So the focus for today and what we're talking about in the session today is that when you're doing your planning, think about your progression, not only just on that forward view, but also take into account what's been done in the past and where you are in that context, because it is multi-decades, right? It's a decennial, a series of events that have to happen here. You can't force it, but you can set expectations that first we do this, then we do this, then we do this, right? It will take time. So let's talk a little bit about decarbonization, because that's where a lot of the attention is. And you've seen this Sankey diagram in the past. You've looked at it in prior lectures. So if we're going to decarbonize, one of the first places you could look isn't necessarily to new types of generation. It might simply be to increase efficiency. So where can you increase efficiency? Well, most of the time, a lot of energy efficiency programs or projects look at consuming less energy at the task level, right? Having more efficient vehicles, more efficient air conditioning, more efficient fans and motors and pumps, right? All the things that fall into the pink boxes here. Well, that's absolutely a good thing to do. And that's where most of our traditional energy efficiency programs come. And we'll be looking at that in detail next class. But there's also the option of losing less or wasting less generation. If you see here, the gray box at the top, most energy that goes into electric generation in transportation, especially, is wasted in the form of heat. And this is something that's always been the case. But when we start to think about efficiency more holistically, a couple of things occur. It's that energy efficiency at the end use, the more efficient AC and lighting and all those things, those are good. But if they're coupled with on-site power generation for wind, solar, battery storage, those types of sources, you may actually reduce the amount of rejected energy, meaning that you're not going to lose that energy through heat loss through the transmission and distribution systems. You might also see a lesser load on those systems if you start to have greater deployment of distributed resources at the community level, right? So when you're thinking about your programs, it's important not to just think, oh, well, we're going to reduce end use consumption. Think about it back along that supply chain, that the megawatt hour of energy reduction that you realize within your community by replacing all your streetlights with LEDs, that electricity that you're saving at the point of use actually has a multiplier effect upstream, because quite a bit of the electricity for those lamps is wasted in transmission. So putting an appropriate accounting forward on your efficiency savings, I think, is going to be really critical for local planning. You can, of course, measure at the local meter level, but I would stipulate that local savings actually have a multiplier effect. That multiplier effect needs to recognize that localized energy savings actually represent a much larger number when you consider the rejected energy losses. After we deal with efficiency and we start to move on to generation, I think it's important to realize that, even though our generating portfolio at the wholesale level is changing, it is far, far away and many, many years away from being completely clean. This is a snapshot of the daily energy generation within PJM, I believe from last Tuesday. And as you see, while there is at the top of the pie chart, there's wind and solar and hydro, and there's nuclear, all of which are non-carbon emitting resources, there's still a significant amount of natural gas, coal, and petroleum that's actually used within our wholesale market. And when you add things up and you realize that, the wind and solar and hydro maybe make up less than 10% of total energy generation within the footprint, you realize that you got to 10% after a good 10 years of pushing. You got another 90% to go, right? And I just give this to you as a word of caution that it's very expensive to build a power plant. And if you're going to replace all the natural gas, all the coal, and eventually all the nuclear plants, you're gonna have to give yourself a lot of money and a lot of time. And these things are just going to have to occur over decades, right? So before you get really far in your thinking to say that, oh, well, we'll just wait for the grid to green up and we'll just track along with that. We'll just recognize that the grid transition is moving pretty slowly, and you need to just understand that that's out of your control, and it's something that's going to occur in its own time. Then, after we've done efficiency and you fix the generation and you have clean energy flowing through the electricity lines, then the idea is, well, let's move towards electrification, because now we can replace burning natural gas and petroleum with clean electricity from the grid. That's fine. But again, it's decades in the making, and it goes back to the 1990s. This is from a research group called Energy and Environmental Economics, and they're looking at decarbonization milestones in California. And you'll just recognize that they go back to the 90s again, right? To the first RPS standards, renewable portfolio standards for California, and then bring it forward. And all through this, you're seeing that they have different policy goals You see the house with the plug symbol. So they're seeing the beginning of installing electric heat pumps as a major step in their decarbonizing plan, and then moving that up to 50%, then 100% heat pump sales. Along those same lines, they're increasing their renewable supply within the state. At the same time, they're increasing their perceived volume of electric vehicles. So even California, with its heavy focus on sustainability and renewables and technology, and frankly, a lot of money going into these initiatives, even they are thinking in decades, right, to get these things done. So give yourself a little grace, right? Everyone wants something to happen right away, but I think that we can learn from looking at the overall efficiency of the electric system, the generation portfolio, and even the aggressive plans for electrification, that you're really looking at plans over the decade. And if you can start to orient yourself that way, that's another way to de-risk the conversations around the transition for folks who are not fully keyed in or paying attention to what the transition really means. If you talk over the decades, I think people are less likely to think that you're going to upset their apple cart and make life difficult. Also, on the electrification side, electrification, and if there are electrify everything, advocates on the call today, I'm not arguing with you. That's fine. I think, though, that electrify everything sounds like an absolutist type of a policy, and I would just caution that a lot of people in the field recognize that there are some things that are easy to electrify and other things that are more challenging to electrify, and frankly might never move towards full electrification. So some of the thinking in the sector now is, well, let's break this into kind of easy, medium, and hard, right? And let's start to address those things that are relatively easier today. And then as technology and market conditions change, we'll move on to further those goals over time. And this is something, just the graphic here is from a group called ClimateWorks. And what they're laying out here is their time scale. They don't put years on it, but they're recognizing that things like new construction and vehicles, they might be able to be electrified in the near term. Over the longer term, it's going to be more of a challenge to change from, say, natural gas, water, and space heating to electric, because you've got not only the utility infrastructure, but also the household infrastructure. The appliances need to be changed. So that's going to happen later. And over time, there might just be some industries where natural gas and coal might continue to be used. And, thinking about steel mills and other foundry type activities, maybe aviation. And I know that there's, cases here and there where a renewable fuel has been found to work, or other approaches are being considered. But again, to do things at scale is a lot different than doing a one-off project. So again, in your planning, think about electrification over a longer time period, and then pick your battles. Think about what is easier to electrify now versus what is more difficult to electrify. And I think you're going to get a lot less resistance over time. So those are just the handy tips in terms of how to maybe start talking about the transition. So when we're thinking about the transition, let's go back and talk about some more of the specific constraints that you're going to be facing as you're developing your policy. And I'd like to come back to my kindergarten level artwork I provided to you in the past. And it's just to give you some examples of where you're going to find some constraints in your policy deliberations. Remember that everything that's going on in the energy sector that's policy driven, in the lower right hand corner, your objectives, your timelines, your metrics, your process, needs to align somewhat with markets and regulation. When they don't, you start to get friction. When the policy ignores the realities of the markets, you lose your ability to achieve scale. You're going to fall short on what technology can actually give you, and then you're going to face challenges getting transactions done the way you want them done, because the market has certain realities that might not align with your policy. Regulation and policy can also have a challenge, because in the regulated environment that is energy, you have incumbents. You got to worry about sequencing of when you're going to do this, and you have to worry about who has the authority to do these things, right? So these are just a few things I'm going to run through with you to put back in your policy toolbox to think about as you're developing your plans for a sustainability plan or an environmental goal, or any of those other types of elements that you might be working on. So let's talk about authority first. Remember that authority on energy matters in the United States are split. There is no single department that does all things energy, and there's no one level of government that does things energy. At the federal level, you've got anywhere from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission all the way across to the Department of Energy, and under DOE is FERC and NERC. They all have their own authorities, right? So you can't just go, there's no one-stop shop at the federal level, nor is there a one-stop shop at the state level. You see, Illinois here has got anywhere from Department of Transportation all the way across back to left to Illinois EPA. They all have something to do with energy, right? And Illinois doesn't always communicate with the federal folks, and that's where NARUC comes in, right? And NARUC is an association made up of mostly retired utility regulatory commissioners. So coordination between these agencies on the horizontal doesn't always occur. And then there's not always a lot of alignment between state and federal policy, right? So that's what you have to deal with. You have to know who has authority, at what level, and how is that aligned with all the other authorities that are relevant to your policy, right? Because your local policy cannot overrun or take the place of federal or state energy policy. It's also helpful to think about incumbents. If you're going to propose a policy that has a radical change from today, you need to understand that there are incumbents, people who already have vested interest in how things work today. On the producer side, there's extractors and refiners, right? People who produce oil, gas, and coal. There's also independent power producers, right? They have a role to play. Then there's secondary parties in the producer sector. There's transporters, those are pipeline operators, those are railroads. Those are companies that own transmission lines. There's employees of these companies, and then there's the unions, right? They're all going to have something to say about your idea. Sometimes it'll be supportive, sometimes they'll have questions, sometimes they'll just be hostile. But you have to understand that this is their livelihood, so it's kind of important to them. There's also intermediaries and consumers you have to think about. Utilities are huge intermediaries. It's going to be hard to do something without the cooperation of the utilities, right? So we know what they're driven by profit. You know that they are constrained under the rules of the Illinois Commerce Commission, and the Commerce Commission is constrained by the Public Utility Act, right? So asking the assistance of the utility sometimes will not get you a straight answer, because the utility is not quite certain what the Illinois Commerce Commission nor the Public Utility Act has to say about your idea. So it's just something to bear in mind. And then consumers, different classes of consumers, from very large industrials down to individual residential customers. And then interest groups, environmental industry groups, and others. Politics gets into energy all the time. I know, you may be shocked, but these are all the folks that you need to deal with, and they represent constraints because they may be for you or against you or neutral. And thinking about that isn't something that I think should keep you awake at night, but it is something that you should think about in your planning. Think about sequencing. You know, our friends at PJM issued a paper at the beginning of this month. I would strongly recommend you read this. It's only about 20 pages long. I think it's an exceptional paper that deals with the main risk of the transition, which is reliability. You know that PJM is our wholesale market operator. Their end-all be-all requirement is to ensure that there is sufficient generation to meet demand within the wholesale market, right? What they have projected in this one diagram is the series of retirements. You see the thermal, the blue portions of the bar are going down over time. Those represent retirements of coal and natural gas plants throughout PJM. See the slightly growing green, those are new renewable resources, and that's terrific. You see the dark gray staying relatively static, that's demand response. You see the light gray, the high to new entry capacity. Those are mostly renewable resources that might come online, but aren't for sure going to come online, right? So there's some uncertainty as to whether or not they do come online. Then you see the pink lines. Solid pink line is the forecast for load growth within PJM over the next several years. And then the dashed pink line, that's if there's a high level of electrification throughout PJM, EVs in particular. So what does this graph tell you? Well, it tells us that if you assume that their projections of electricity demand growth over time are accurate, that sometime around 2027, we're in a position where we don't have a high level of certainty that we'll have enough capacity to meet demand. And that condition gets worse over time as we see more retirements of thermal resources. So sequencing is something that you need to bear in mind when you're thinking about particularly your clean energy goals and reliability. And do our local plans take into account this risk of potential shortages at the wholesale level, right? Something to think about. And then thinking about scale. You know, the state of Illinois under Climate Equitable Jobs Act is moving about $585 million a year into renewables. That money runs through the Illinois Power Agency. That budget is managed by the Illinois Power Agency. The dollars are actually spent by the utilities. But when you think about this, the new policy is to have a 40% renewable goal by 2030-31. All right. In reality, what the IPA has put forward in their most recent renewable resources plan is a grid of all their existing contracts and what they expect to come out in the future. See down the left column, they've got their program year, and then they start calling off. Okay, well, we have long-term power purchase agreements from 2010. We have legacy distributed generation renewables. We've got forward procurements that were entered into between 2017 and 2019. We've got adjustable block program purchases for 2019 to 2021. And then we have all these other purchases that are being supported by the Renewable Portfolio Standard. When you then take a look at the last three columns, the total, which is how much renewables are being purchased through the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the overall RPS target, you see a little bit of a difference between those two, right? Go down to 2030-31 at the bottom. The IPA, which manages the RPS, says that the goal is $48.5 million, or 48.5 million renewable energy credits that year, 48.5 million megawatt hours of renewable energy production. But the agency is only expecting 9.7 million. That means that they're 38.8 million short. That means that even with spending over $500 million a year, that the state is probably only going to get to an 8% RPS goal by 2030-31. So even though you put a goal on paper, if it's not backed by an adequate budget or process, both of which are a problem here, you're not going to get your results. So if you're planning on saying, oh, well, we don't have to do anything locally because the state has an RPS and it's going to get to 40% by 2030, I don't think that that's a rational expectation, right? You're not going to be able to ride the coattails of what ComEd is doing on your behalf through the RPS. What about technology? Well, technology is great. Technology allows us to do a lot of these things in the transition. However, technology has certain risks. You see here in the center, the various technologies that enable the transitions, anywhere from batteries at the top, all the way down to 3D printing on the bottom. You see over on the left, the supply risks that each of these technologies are facing in the market, right? Rare earth elements, REEs, you see are very high risk. If you don't have access to rare earth elements, or their cost goes up, so goes the cost of wind and traction motors. If you see higher cost for scandium, right, you're going to have difficulty in 3D printing. If you see all the way down at the bottom, challenges with nickel, manganese, copper, it's going to affect all of these all these technologies, and it could slow the progress of development in the sectors that are located over on the right, the renewable and the e-mobility and specialized industries. So these are things that you can't control, but there's something to bear in mind that, just because you want to have fuel cells, well, there are challenges with those fuel cells if you have a shortage of cobalt or natural graphite, right? So again, these are things that are out of your control. They're market-based barriers. And then, of course, probably the most immediate issue are transactional challenges. In Illinois, every consumer makes their own purchasing decisions, right, for energy. That's just how it is. The village, the city, the town, the county, the state cannot, under current law, tell or restrict the choices of consumers. You cannot simply say, our town is going to have 100% renewable energy purchases by every consumer in the municipality. You cannot force that, right? Because of the 1997 Choice Act that was passed in Illinois. Every consumer has the right to choose their own electricity supply as it stands now. So setting a goal for 100% renewables is going to be difficult to achieve because of transactional friction, right? So I know I'm giving you a lot of these constraints, and it's not to bring you down. It's not to tell you that you can't do things, but it's to say, look, let's be realistic in what we can achieve, because if you're realistic and you achieve actual goals, you're going to have the credibility to then move on to do other things. So here's a recommendation. The role of municipal government. First step, I think, is to enhance your credibility by improving what you directly control. Look at your own operations, right? Look at your own building systems and their efficiency, your own supply contracts, your own vehicle fleets, your own disposal contracts, right? Control those things that you have ultimate control over. If you can show improvement in the efficiency and the reduction and the resulting reductions in emissions from your own facilities, people will trust you when you recommend the same for them, right? You can do this quicker. You can do this on your own, and you don't face so many of the challenges or the friction points because you're in control. Once you have optimized what you control directly, then you can move on to sponsoring, right? You can put programs together that are helpful to those portions of your community that are not under your direct control. So municipal aggregation is a great example of this. You can have a contract that has a clean energy component, or you can promote community solar. You can establish a PACE program. You can do group buys for solar and maybe someday storage. You could even promote the demand response programs that ComEd puts out already, right? You can maybe assist in bringing about charging infrastructure for EVs, right? So you can sponsor these things and help make the transition easier for those within your community. And then lastly, you can influence. Municipalities are hugely influential when it comes to regulation. So your permits, codes, and zoning, your taxes and fees, and requiring benchmarking reports, your development agreements, they can all move towards more sustainable goals. But again, to my mind, it only makes sense to do those things of influencing and sponsorship in conjunction with or after you have optimized what you already control. Because a lot of this is about credibility. A lot of it's about trust. You can build trust by building a track record, and that track record starts with your own facilities. So with that, I appreciate your time. I think we're got a few minutes left for questions and answers. And again, I appreciate you spending your lunchtime with us.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm particularly noted that the last slide, control, sponsor, and influence, is of course the acronym CSI, which is ever so appropriate. Any questions or comments? There's a few add-ons in the chat that our friend Cheryl put in there. The PJM report that Mark referenced is about a 15-pager. I have a copy of that. You referenced the environmental economics group out of California. There's on their website, their homepage, there's a reference to Illinois in particular, and there's a report there. It's really interesting, actually.
Yeah,
anyone at all?
Yeah, Illinois is getting a lot of recognition. The goals are aggressive. They're moving into that top tier of states. Used to only be like New York and California, right, and maybe sometimes Massachusetts, but Illinois is up in that transition state leadership role. So there's a lot of attention, but proof is going to be in the pudding. Are they actually going to perform? It's right. I'm not saying it was easy to pass legislation, but it's a lot easier to put words on paper than to actually get 1 million electric vehicles on the road, right?
Mark, I'm going to ask you a question that you probably don't want to hear yet. You may have already been asked before, and I figure with what do we have, about 4 minutes left? Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask a question that's been percolating in my head for the last week in particular. In light of all that's happening with the ComEd trial, does that not play into everything we're trying to achieve, or is it a wait and see kind of scenario?
Oh, I think it feeds in. It absolutely feeds in. I think it, back to one of my favorite words, I think it provides context. Okay. I think that, and I know that your community has its own municipal utility and that has a different flavor, but my sense is that people who are going to pay attention to what's going on in that trial are going to realize, or they're going to have to relearn that the utility is not a public sector entity. It is a for-profit entity. It is not your friend, and it does things for its own interests. Right. And I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm just saying they're regulated that way. I mean, if you stood to make $1.8 billion and it only cost you $200 million, you'd do that all the time, wouldn't you? So I think that for municipalities in particular, you need a strong partnership with your utility, right? You need that. But I think you need to come at that not with hat in hand, but as an equal. Okay. And I think that this trial will reiterate that the utility is not all powerful, that they are a creature of regulation, and that they need to perform. And I think it's a good thing that this has come out. It's been known in the industry for decades that the utilities ran the house in Illinois. So it's good that it's out in the open. I don't know if that's responsive to what you're asking.
No, I think it is. I'm delighted to see the light shining, as it were. But you're right. Geneva is unique, as is Batavia and other communities on this call. We are the trustees of the utility. So it's certainly a more intimate relationship with our ratepayers. So.
Absolutely. And far greater level of scrutiny, right? It could come up every second Tuesday at 7 o'clock, right?
Right.
There could be public comment about your performance. So I would I would just encourage the municipalities to really think about how important you are to the utility now. You know, utility is somewhat weakened. They have their 5-year plan that's put together. And just so you know, the ComEd is projecting a 50% increase in delivery rates for non-residential customers over the next 4 years.
Right.
So think about that and what that does to your residents and your own operations. And
well, you know, Mark, I was in a good mood until you arrived today, so thank you very much. It was
kind of a downer.
kind of a
I'm here
Anyone
to help.
else? Yeah, a downer but helpful. Yes. Any other questions or comments, Cheryl, Edith?
Nothing in the chat, but please speak
Okay.
up if you have something or raise your hand. We've got 1 more minute, so if you've got something to say, please volunteer.
Again, I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning too. I think this particular class is extraordinarily enlightening. We all have a lot of challenges ahead. We know that, but I think if we face them with reality, and I think Mark's favorite word is what was the word you used? Rationale. It helps a lot. So,
well, I have a question for the group, real quick. For those communities that have put together sustainability plans, how has implementation gone? Right? Have you found that these constraints are real, or am I imagining this?
anyone chime in? Just go ahead and pop
Yeah.
in.
So thank you, Mark, for that question. I don't think it's challenging. I think the challenging that we have as we work in this space of work is the staff, and having quality staff that's educated and knowledgeable on how we move the needle a little bit further. So having these discussions and being able to partner with my colleagues, those that have a more aggressive plan in place, is very, very, very helpful. Those that do not have sustainability commissions or are in the space of work that we all need to be a part of, it's a lack. So we got to continue to have these conversations, and I've actually taken some really good notes from today on the conversation that we're having, but we just have a lot of communities that's not even tapping into the space of sustainability, and they are unaware, misinformed, and just don't have the staff power to help the community at large. So that's where the issues are. Like, how do we get coordinators, or is it funding available to help some of the other communities? And the Mayor Caucus is aware that we have a C4, our cross climate collaborative initiatives with the 14 communities. And that's the work that we're doing, is just trying to educate the communities on what it looks like. And we have some communities that's way ahead of us in a lot of the programs, but we have a lot of communities that they are really starting at zero, like day one. And this work been going on for over 20 years. So it's a lot of catching up to do, but it's important work that we share, like in this space that we're doing, like these classes and workshops and stuff. So that's why I'm here to participate, so that I'm able to share with everyone. But that's the issue for us, is that the lack of staff and the knowledge base. We don't have the capacity.
And the investments necessary to build that capacity. You're right, Mayor Thompson. Well said.
Thank you, Mayor.
Folks, if that's it, you are free to enjoy your Thursday afternoon. So thank you again for joining us, Professor Pruitt, as always. Thank you very much. All this information is going to be on the Mayor's Caucus website, so please check it out. I just saw Cheryl put in a link to the PJM report. You can visit their website as well if you want to read through that. 15 pages, fascinating information. Again, thank you all for your time, for your investment, for your commitment. Enjoy your day. Be safe.